We are excited to have our special guest, Marvin Wayne Brittingham, who's a dear colleague of mine at the University of Texas at Arlington. We're both in the College of Business. He is in the management department, and I'm in the econ department, and nonetheless, we bridge the floors and work together. And so I'm so happy to have you here today, Marvin. So thank you. Also, you may have heard that we shout out to all our guests, but we had a mini lecture already for Jennifer Birdsong from Texas Women, so welcome to her and others. And as I said, maybe we're going to have another session with Jennifer because everything she said so far is exciting and very interesting. So this is our Thursday webinar, and it's on adaptive leadership. Marvin has 30 years of experience in large corporations, in HR, a variety of situations. It's too many for me to memorize. He will have all kinds of anecdotes and examples that will include his experience. But for many years, he was head of global HR for Nokia. If I said it correctly, that was one of the major companies he worked for. He spent years going global in terms of his adaptive leadership and HR experiences. As I said, as he gets rolling, he'll bring all that to bear. We want to thank everyone again. This is part of our corporate education series. We are hosted by the great Mike Ullman and his team, as well as UTA Fort Worth, our wonderful satellite campus in Fort Worth, and the College of Business, which is located in Arlington, coordinates fully and completely with Mike and his team to bring you this webinar series. So without, as they say, further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Brittingham. Marvin, thanks again, and just get rolling, buddy.
Okay, Bill, I really appreciate you asking me to come on board to teach this, or really to talk to it today to the audience, simply because the academic environment, as I've been here, this is my fourth year going into working with the management department, and I am not a PhD from a research standpoint. I'm what they classify as a scholar practitioner. Yes, I do have 30 years of experience, and my last role was with Aon Hewitt, the huge consulting firm, where I was the CHRO of the consulting stream. So you have about 30,000 consultants in different locations around the world. I was the chief HR executive, reporting to the president, CEO of that unit, and we traversed the world. We had 7 different directors, one for Asia, Latin America, the United States, Canada, Europe, and of course, Scandinavia. After 2 passports, it comes to a time in your life where you say it's time to sort of sit back and transpose this information that I've so gained over the years to the student body so that they can learn to be good leaders, but more so, how they're going to have to adapt in such a changing world. The one constant that I always impose on my students is change. It is the one consistent that is always going to be around in the world. And there are many forms of leadership in the sense of conventional and adaptive, but I'm going to go through a little of that today, just in looking through the overview in the sense of the adaptive leadership descriptions. We will be talking a number of different business models, and we will segue into what I call scenario planning as a tool or part of a toolkit you can develop relative to adaptive leadership. And how does really adaptive leadership work? And then we'll look at some strengths. We'll even, as we look at the audience, maybe to come back with some criticisms and applications, as we had one participant already talk about, AI, HR, and some of the other things, because they all link together. So in the beginning, there's conventional and or adaptive leadership, but there's many other forms of leadership as denoted within textbooks that are out there. But I really want to look at the conventional leadership stream here first, based on having a baseline, a good baseline, where we look at just some highlights of what leadership is. It's the exercise of authority. We all see that in our textbooks. We talk about maintenance of norms. We're about giving directions. In giving those directions, delegating, pulling teams together, trying to get to the operational activities as an output. And then we look at, the individuals. You are confident in the directions, your results, in useful outcomes, because those outcomes are paramount within adaptive leadership and even conventional leadership. More so, and this is interesting in the working with organizational competencies, and in teaching this, competency is a knowledge and a skill. Organizations themselves have to have specific competencies. And as an example, while at Aon Hewitt, we were notorious for our project management offices, the structure and process of everything we did. But within HR, we were all about systems, technology, and how we could aggregate data to the point of mining that data that was out there. But, as the world changes, so does leadership competencies and leadership activities. So now we look at what really is changing in this, and I'm talking from a global level too, but as I discuss global levels, the one thing you learn in global business, though it may be China, though it may be Latin America, though it may be Europe, Canada, or whatever, you have to look for common themes, because to manage, you have to find that commonality in what goes, and then you have to extend and expand those activities that are differentiators or problem areas that you're going to have to look at. You're going to have challenging norms. I mean, all you have to do today is look at what's going on geopolitically, geoeconomic, and from the cultural aspects that exist today. Norms are constantly in flux. There are primary stakeholders from a business standpoint and shareholders that we have to really address when we look at how we lead in organizations. We've got to look at situations and complexity, but one thing that's true is uncertainty. Even today, within the technology space, the healthcare space, the finance space, the political space, we're in upheaval right now just due to change. We're going through somewhat of a political issue in our own United States of America, but if you look at Hungary and you look at what's going on in some of the Latin American countries, there's huge uncertainty right now. And then we've got to work outside our organizational competencies. What does that really mean? We have to really look at what we're delivering in competencies in our competency models, because a lot of corporations build competency models relative to how they operate and what they're trying to get an output to their shareholders and stakeholders. So it bodes to the question of what really is adaptive leadership. Now, what I've done here, I put the narrative, but I put a business model next to it. And I've done some research over time, whether I've worked for Fujitsu, a Japanese company. I've worked for Nokia in the sense of my career. I've worked for domestic US companies, and I've spent a large amount of time in countries that are somewhat socialistic, which here in the United States, we find that socialism is bad. But when you really start educating yourself on the political structures of countries and how they deal in change, how they deal in leadership, you're going to find there are a lot of common themes. It's not as bad as it's really cracked up to be, but you have to look at how leadership is a process based on principle, shared responsibilities for future success of the business service, period. In the sense of how they have to go to market and how they have to operationalize. It means sharing risk. It looks at resources and ideas and decision-making capabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about the decision-making capabilities. And the future successes of an organization becomes something simple as everyone's business. In hierarchical companies, sometimes it's missed in translation and the trickle down of leadership, meaning the CEO, who really sets the common structure and the culture of an organization. And then in turn, we're going to, it's known sometimes as the Polackery, when power is shared amongst everyone, but is it really, in the sense of when you look at hierarchical companies and how they operate? Then there's the key features of adaptive leadership processes. We're going to talk about those further when it relates to scenario planning. But if you look at it, in the common theme of is the organization's focus. That is going to be consistent in any company in the sense of what is their focus. And then they're going to look at, and I'm going to save the leadership capacity at the top, but I'm going to start with shared responsibilities. There are multiple teams, IT, HR, finance, that all exist within organizations. But when we look at adaptive leadership, is this something each individual business unit does, or is it something that by committee or by organizing that we give a very sharp focus to the business to ensure that we are going to operationalize any activities that are delivered? We look at the elephant in the room, meaning and individuals who really know there's something really wrong in a that might be controversial issues that are subject matter in companies that they get very concerned about, but guess what? Never talk about it. Never really talk about it, and it's sort of sidebarred instead of put in a priority list. There's the issues of independent judgment, because you have so many different individuals that you're working with as teammates in making judgment calls. But one thing that's very interesting, and we have a participant in the webinar today that has prior training background, and as an HR executive, I put huge weight of equity on continuous learning. I once gave a speech to my workforce about learning on demand, and they sort of looked at me like I was a little bit crazy. But in today's world of adaptive leadership, guess what? It's emerging. I've witnessed and listened to a few presentations on continuous learning activity that's out there, not only in research, but in companies today. Now, so how does it work? I mean, when you look at organizations, they're deeply multidimensional, especially multinational organizations. They face key situational challenges. We're going to go back to leadership behavior later on as we go through the discussion. And as work changes, they've got to be able to adapt to that. But one of the most important activities that all organizations are going to have to do or learn to do is the execution and delivery of mobilizing individuals during adaptive work, because not only are they doing their own work, they could be offset by other responsibilities in a change model and change management education, which is one of the activities that most companies fail at. And when I say fail, they decide to make an organizational shift, or they want to make a shift relative to an economic environment, or there's some major crises that they do or have to face, but they never educate as to the why or what's happening. Change management becomes critical in every organization. Now, I've been part of 2 companies that had within their training organization just a whole change management educational unit, and I've got to work with them. So in looking at that, and I do and have done a lot of executive coaching to law firms, to manufacturing firms, as I still have my own consultancy. And leaders have to learn to step back from a challenging situation and view it from a very high level, or the balcony as they like to refer to it. This Mark Linsman was the researcher who did some work on viewing from the balcony. There's determination if change creates technical or adaptive challenges. Well, the answer is yes. It is constantly in motion as continuous learning change is continuous, so we are always going to face some new challenge, and you have to anticipate. Challenges are adaptive. Leaders engage in several specific leadership behaviors, and we'll talk a little bit about leadership behaviors as I go through a model that is going to be on a slide here shortly, and move to adaptive processes. And most companies struggle with what is that process? What is an adaptive process? You have to look at your current state, but what's really as they go through this educational process of change that they have to address. And then getting on the balcony where it is that high level point of view, and it's really the metaphor for stepping out of the fray and finding perspective during a challenging situation. While we were saying to ourselves, well, challenging situation, it creates stress. It creates a scenario where individuals really don't know what to do. They start to inquire, question, and they even question the status of where they are even today.
Marvin.
Yes, sir.
Real quick, everything so far is very, very interesting, of course. Let me ask you a quick question before you tell me how it works. Was Steve Jobs a good adaptive leader?
In my opinion, from my readings of Job, he's somewhat of a moderate kind of guy on adaptive change. He was an innovator, and he drove coming out of technology, because prior to me becoming an educator and in my corporate tier, I worked for a cell industry and computing industry. I worked for ICL International Computers based in London, which Fujitsu bought, and I was in the transitional team of that from the US. And the cell phone industry as it was, and I can use Nokia as a prime example. Nokia had 36 to 37% of the marketplace in their cell industry. Jobs came out with iOS and totally blew them off the market. Now there's the reason of this. Jobs was so innovative in his thinking, and he was such a techie, he delegated down to a lot of his operational executives to manage the change that took place, Bill. I would say he was mediocre in his ability to be adaptive. Also, one of the outcomes of Apple, and you can see it even today, they tend to be a laggard in the industry. They're innovative in their softwares and how they deliver their product, but you never see them leading like in Samsung, where Samsung comes out with, we've got X DPI in our phones, and they're analog, meaning they're Android. Which is a bolt-on process that doesn't have its own ecosystem. So Job, in my opinion, was somewhat of a mediocrity kind of guy when it came to adaptive leadership. He was more of a driver than he was somebody who was adapting. And he showed that in his lagging sometimes of product development and his organization.
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions before I move on to the next slide?
And by the way, sorry, I don't mean to jump in here real quick. I just wanted to say, in case we're not taking a look at the chat box, I've also put it in there. Feel free, by the way, to engage with us through that chat function and ask questions to Marvin at any time during this webinar. So I just wanted to put it out there.
Please interrupt if you have to. So I put it in a model for you all relative to look at the elements of adaptive leadership. And once again, that high level view, I like on the balcony, to me, in my consultative background, that's a PMO, somebody who is really scouring and looking from a top level, but it goes here to think politically, orchestrate, give the word back, hold steady, manage the hunger, and what's on the line. And let's talk about the think politically. Corporations, in their own way, are their own microcosms and their own ecosystems of a function. whether we like politics or not, every organization has its depth of politics, good, bad, or indifferent. And you're going to have to learn to deal with it. So you have to think politically. If you have a large organization, it is not easy to move the Titanic relative to making decisions, because you're dealing with a board. You're dealing with a multitude of large groups of people, and in turn, you have to know the politics of the organization so that you can cut through and make decisive decisions, which is very, very difficult. You've got to orchestrate the conflict. There are many conflicts. And when I talk about conflicts and adaptive leadership, don't think of just from an academic standpoint. There are natural disasters. There's educational disasters and shootings and how the school systems have to function with it. There are from the oil industry, Deepwater Horizon, if you recall that, Equifax, there were data breaches, and these are all major crises that companies have had to deal with. Financial, Wells Fargo, if anybody remembers the Wells Fargo issues and what's going on. We live in an era of technology where breaches are becoming common, unfortunately. And why? Because people learn to break the software, and they're easier to go in there. But to orchestrate it requires a management team, not of one, but of many. And in companies that I've worked in, we've always, mostly the European companies, they've always anticipated something occurring, and they would establish units or a unit that was comprised of HR, the training function, simply because of the educational aspects. There were operational people that had changed management skill sets or competencies that would come in and function with guiding, more of a staff role, the leadership, once they define their strategy development, to go and implement whatever it is. It says give words back. There was constant communication. The one person, when I became global head of HR, the very first person I ever hired on my team was my senior executive for all corporate communication, because what you say and what words are written and how they're delivered to the people can be sometimes misconstrued. So you have to make sure you're very precise in the delivery of everything that you have being delivered to individuals regarding corporate communication. Hold steady. It is very hard to hold steady in a time of crisis, in a time of stress. When I was in the Marine Corps, it was very interesting when going through TBS or some of the schools, because they're always under fire or something was going on, but they taught you to do things in only threes. Nothing more than threes to maintain a foundational aspect, because you get above and beyond 3 or 4 or 5 individuals, activities, excuse me, not individuals, but activities. It became too complex and you couldn't really stay focused. Your hunger, you may want to go forward when you needed to go backwards. You got to really manage that hunger of activity and define a strategy that is very precise. From a psychometric standpoint of anchoring yourself, and I've been in these situations to maintain stability of one's self. I have been, in my passport travels, I was stuck in Europe on 9/11. I was coming out of Finland to Switzerland for a meeting, and then I went into Milan and Rome for some other business meetings. And in returning back home, I was on a plane when a flight attendant said, "Act like I'm telling you a story," and told us that a plane had gone into the World Trade Center. And my wife was traveling on that trip with me, and she is an international flight attendant. And she put on her badge, but she carried it with her all the time, went up to the galley and came back and said, "Buckle up, we don't know where we're going." We wound up going to Heathrow in London, and I was more concerned as we were being diverted about my team and where were they and what was I going to do once I did get on the ground, and I had to anchor me. I had to get myself to the point where I could go and direct, manage, and control the situation, because I knew once I was on the ground, though I was in this far off place, I was going to have to lead an organization through a very trying time. And, you know, what I'm putting here in this leadership elements is really basic. And then I had to look at what was on the line. What did I have to go out and be prepared to deliver? And you have to go through these scenarios in your mind as to how you're going to communicate, how you're going to manage through this, because you know the organization and its processes and what its culture is all about, and you know how the change management team is. And it is very, very difficult for anyone in an adaptive leadership, especially as an individual manager, as a group manager, or even as the CEO, as they go out there to deliver a strategy and formulate an outcome to people. Any questions from anybody before I go to this next slide? Because I'm going to go into core leadership since we only have 45 minutes. But this is somewhat of a model, and I had to give this some thought, even though it's out there in the research for individuals within adaptive leadership. You remember when I said you think of things in threes, in the sense of strategy, action, and results. Or as I say to my students sometimes, assess, adapt, and overcome, because these are all of the activities you're going to have to seriously look at when you're looking at an adaptive leadership model. Vision, the acumen of the individuals, the planning side becomes critical, and then more so, courage to lead. I was on assignment to Dex Media up in Denver when I was with Aon Hewitt. I was on site as their consultant as Dex was going through an acquisition and merger, and we had all kinds of issues with the incumbent CEO relative to his ability to lead. And from a coaching standpoint, it was probably one of the toughest activities I've had to deal with, because the capability was there. It was just the planning aspects, and his core competency had never had to go through an activity such as this. And we basically started off with looking at and developing an action plan where we formulated teams relative to making decisions. We developed a standardized, and I say standardized, a communication process that was one that was delivered in common to all units that were out there. And then we had to mobilize or delegate to the teams from a change management standpoint that was out there. And the activity that became really tough was, how much risk do they want to take or not to take in the results of focus, because most companies are not agile. And I'll use the example of Ericsson in Scandinavia, another big telecom company, versus Nokia. Ericsson, during my tenure, and they were competitively out there, were 130,000 plus employees worldwide. Nokia never, ever, ever grew above 60,000 employees, about half the size of Ericsson. The question is voted why, and why were the Finnish mentality relative to how they led an organization, why was it that way? Their primary reason was agility, their ability to be able to turn a dime, to adapt, to be able to execute very fast. It was not, they did not believe in having a Titanic to change, to try and shift it while it was on the sea. They wanted the ability to move fast, and they were masterful at it. The Finns had a culture of being able to make that happen, but their business models that they looked at were well thought out. So when you really look at the adaptive leadership in what individual managers and organizations have to look at, and there are 4 of them. They go into emotional intelligence. They've got to look at organizational justice, and they've got to look at character and development. And in one organization where we had major crises, I had to meet with the CEO, and I had to ask him from the standpoint of the crisis team that we were developing what was most important to him. And this was during my tenure at USAA in San Antonio, Texas. If you're not aware of who they are, they insure military individuals, and in turn, they're way back in 1976, they were one of the first companies to ever go paperless. And then the author In Search of Excellence rated them one of the best run organizations in the United States. And when I asked the CEO what was most important to him, he said integrity. He did not want anyone on a management adaptive team who did not have the capacity of integrity, and he was huge on decision fairness and organizational justice. Those were 2, and every organization is going to be different because their corporate cultures are different, their industries are different, and what they have to face from a compliatory issue are all different as they exist today. The emotional intelligence of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management, and then you have development of lifelong learning, which is basically continuous learning. And how do we develop others? One of the basic tenets of management is we develop others as we grow them. It is not, well, we got to hold you because I'm not going to get a headcount budget. It's to grow them within the organization. Questions? The key activities we are going to do is identifying challenges. And this is kind of interesting simply because is the issue of technical. Leaders can fix a problem. They use authority or expertise. They also use technology to their benefit. Is the issue both technical and adaptive? Policies, rules may need to be developed. Anytime there is change activity in any organization, anytime there is adaptive leadership, you are constantly going to always look at the organization's policies and how they affect others and how they affect the leaders in giving them the authority to do the job, and the people that support the organizational change, because they are to be probably the most important because they're going to be doing the heavy towing of activities. And then is the issue adaptive? There's transition between technical and adaptive leadership and behaviors. And the other activities are how we as leaders behave. And that is just one that we always have to be able to adapt to and remain flexible in doing. So how do we go about it? And this is more of the high-level vision and different viewpoints and what we have to look at relative to the organization's culture. How is it structured? Is it an MNE? Is it domestic? In today's supercharged world, on the geopolitical side, how does it affect others in other organizations and countries and how we operate? We've got to look at the system perspective, as I said, in the how it interconnects, the biological perspective, or the biological, where how do we develop people and adapt to, it says here internal clues and external environments. The internal clues is the organization itself and its policy, process, and procedures, but yet what's being imposed by that crisis or that external environment that is, facing us as a challenge. And then service orientation. And this gets to our internal leadership teams and serving people by They say here that diagnostics of the problems and prescribing solutions. It sounds somewhat healthcare oriented, but it's not. As leaders, we always have to diagnose problems, and we have to prescribe some solution for the people, and it involves really around everything from how we're going to deliver and fix the problem and how we educate the people, but we have to prescribe some kind of solution. And then there's the psychotherapy perspective, where people adapt successfully when they face a problem directly. This is key. I have worked in organizations where they wanted to throw or under the blanket the issues, but yet they had a strategy of implementation. The two didn't compute. And what I mean by that is, as this statement says, you have to distinguish between fantasy and reality and resolve internal conflicts and make those hard decisions and have new attitudes and behaviors. That is very, very difficult when, say, for instance, I would be faced with a problem within the Italian operation in our office. And because of their work schedules, because of the cultural differences and how they perceive an issue, we constantly, I would have to drive my team to do something it's not rocket science. I would always tell them, when I say tell them, influence them, look for the common themes within a global perspective, because there are common themes. Our compliatory environment may be very difficult. Our union environment, because we have unions here, but they have work councils overseas. And overseas, within a work council, you're not really going to make any policy changes or any kind of change management activity without going to the work council first. It's not, let's go to the president of the European operation and trickle down. You got to get through that work council, because if you don't get them to buy into whatever the new policies, procedures, and activities are, it's not going to work. And in turn, you're going to have resistance. And with that resistance, the change that you're going to have as an outcome is we won't do it. So there are compliatory issues that we always have to look through. And these 4 activities for everyone, I think, are just some foundational things that we as leaders and managers can do. Any other questions before I proceed?
Nope, just a comment that this is a very amazing topic and you're doing a great job. So not necessarily a question, but a compliment.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Marvin, I wanted to echo the compliment, but you just pointed out the importance of buy-in.
Yes, it is.
You know, at the, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth. So if we look at the COVID crisis, it would appear then that mandates are not an effective way to get buy-in. What is your view?
Repeat that one more time about the buy-in with COVID. Is it the who, what, when, or where? I just want to make sure, Bill.
Well, the approach from the politicians at present is to command people to do things.
Yeah.
You're saying that in an organization like Nokia, which faced, you know, similar, though not exact, crises, you're talking about getting buy-in. It seems to me that if we look at the COVID approach, it's all about mandates. So maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's mandates, right? Or maybe you're right. Maybe the mandators ought to be working more on buy-in from the population as opposed to mandating. It's a tough question on purpose.
Yeah, and it is. And I'm going to give you in response a typical MBA answer. It depends. And it depends because we politically in this country, we let our guard down. Simple as that, in the sense we had a pandemic unit that could have gone out there and maybe helped squelch this whole issue. And the issue of buy-in in a political environment is one of the most challenging that we have to face today.
But yet you said that there's a political environment within a
Yes,
corporation as
that's
well.
true. That's true. And it is very political. Now, your question is addressing politics as it is in politics, which itself is one of adaptive leadership. But
Well,
in case,
my point would be that politicians are not a good adaptive leaders, and they need to look to someone like yourself who's done it successfully.
you're correct in that statement, because they themselves have their own set of rules and activities. And the other issues is, in this democratic society we are supposed to live in, that mandate to me was very authoritarian. And you're right, they're not really apt to change. Part of it is how our structure of 50 decentralized states.
Sure.
And when there's no standardization, there is no, if we went back to looking at leadership and how we make decisions and information sharing and those outcomes, you've got 50 areas that don't want to follow along. The other issue is, I don't think there was anyone who really looked at any common theme of all 50 states of the problems and go through any analytics to understand how they should take an approach. We turned our heads as a country, and to your point, I could be wrong in that regard. And that doesn't mean that in adaptive leadership, this is the 100% foolproof way. We did mandate, and I think mandating has created an issue where it was for self-preservation of protection.
Yeah.
For individuals, some people believed it, some people don't. They didn't want to buy into it.
Right.
And information communication and how it was delivered to the masses, I think, was disjointed.
Yeah.
So to your point, it probably wouldn't work until they all come together to come to some leadership protocol to say, this is how we're going to operate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have a lot to learn from your points here in terms of the next crisis.
Oh yeah, well, even here at the school, last semester, we went through COVID hitting, and instructors were given 5 days to go online. I mean, that was a telling activity, as you and I both went through that.
And that was more than enough, though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. And it was
not facetiously.
A big pardon?
I said I say that facetiously.
Yeah.
That an expectation that somebody who's been teaching 30 years, could. I guess that's pretty quick adaptation. How about that?
Yeah, that's true. But in practice, I mean, I just use an example. A company merger mid-size creates tension, employees regarding job the new owners want to bring in. So once again, I go back to that adaptive challenge, or those common themes, in the sense of what we have to do from a vision statement, and then figuring out in a merger 2 totally different political systems.
Right.
And when, because of companies, they may be in industry-wise the same, but the hardest thing when I was the chief and I went into a company that we were going to be the consultants for the merger was looking for what's similar and what's not similar and what is very similar, and then the leadership competencies of the individuals and their visions. Did they really meet, or did they not meet, to the point of pay scales, overtime, and everything. And in a global unit where the US makes an edict, say for instance, for one of their units in Latin America, well, that's not when you're going to flatten the curve. It's going to be a constant curve for a while as you try to get that buy-in from all of the individuals there within that business unit. But then there are also the issues of the compliance and the economic issues within that specific country that you're going to have to address. So adaptability doesn't come easy. And to your point, in some companies, they've mandated it. In our own political system, we've mandated it here.
Yeah.
So in practice, these models are really for edification of individuals out in the audience that they can use on these slides. But I want to go into, so the planning activity or the process itself is one where planning becomes key. Not only do the leaderships have to embrace change, do they have to look at how they, from a psychometric standpoint, deal with the employees and oneself. It is coming up to the planning process. So what I have utilized in the past, and though it's not out there bloating as scenario planning, and there are different ways companies have in their planning activities, but as a common model, I go into scenario processing. I want to check something here. Yeah, in the sense of a planning process to remain flexible and adaptive for leaders. And there are basically 8, and I try to simplify these as best I can in focus issues, identifying what a person or organization will focus on, the focus, customers' demand, suppliers, competitors, production technology, very complex. External forces, and this is one that I think everybody, even us within the United States in our political environment right now, the geopolitical, geoeconomic, and the geocultural and technology forces and other insights. And you also have to look at the less obvious dynamics in, migration patterns of people and demographics and the different technologies. And this issue of migration patterns is very interesting because when you, as an example, while in Finland and Europe and Austria and whatever, while at Hewitt, we had our service operation based in Krakow, Poland. And we were going to set up an outpost in Hungary. And we went into Hungary, we looked at it, and Hungary was on a different political tact and mission than some of the rest of the European Union was at the time. And I had to come back with a decision that we shouldn't enter the market and that we weren't going to because of the immigration patterns and the migration patterns. And I'll have to digress a little bit. We always go into different countries looking at the educational standards and what they are going to produce in the short term and long term to help feed the industry itself. Were they producing enough technology? Were they producing enough engineers? Were there the STEM education for the high school levels that were coming out? And that was always a huge piece of wherever we set up an outpost going into any place, whether it be domestic, US, or whatever. There were the critical uncertainties in the sense for, convergent processes, or how do we prioritize because of everything changing so fast. The logic, placing the organization's eggs in one basket, or do we want to spread out those eggs to make sure that we touched everything we could change or implement within the organization? Scenarios. I don't know if you've ever been in a shared service platform where they have in the technology companies. We used to have, open shared service platforms where everybody would put in their ideas. And it was kind of interesting in the outcome of the analytics as to what we saw and how many different scenarios we could go in different directions. And from a leadership standpoint, to be in a leadership meeting where they're looking at all these outcomes and the differentiators they had to deal with, it's painstaking. They would sometimes have to just delimit or end and come to a hardcore decision, or to your point, Bill, mandate relative to how they were going to proceed. And then there were the implications and options that they had to come up to associated with predetermining elements and the demographics. Demographics play such a critical point in planning at a large scale organization at a global level. And it tells you a story when you start to really dive deep into demography to understand what's happening here in Texas. This is the first time the birth rate in Texas has diminished, and people don't even know that. What is increasing in Texas are the minority population and the shift that's taking place within the demography of just the United States itself overall. It is constantly in flux. And immigration, our birth rate, when we look at the educational processes and outputs that schools are doing, there's some schools and systems that are producing tremendous STEM talent, but that's not consistent around the whole country. And when you look at other countries and you look at the kinds of activities that are out there, they do a very good job. As an indicator, the United States is number 2 in the world for educational systems, number 37 or 8 when it comes to STEM. So, in a crisis situation, that has to be considered in the sense of what we're going to do futuristic and currently for planning activities that exist. And then there's other early indicators of differentiations on scenarios and important for moving that into the strategy. Now, the part
I was going to say is our time is kind of winding down.
Okay.
You think you can use this slide to give us the key takeaways? I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, this 8 scenario planning, or this one here in the sense of process.
Yeah, either one.
Either one.
Yeah, just to key takeaways. I don't want to give you time to kind of put a nice bow on the box before we leave.
As leaders, as an adaptive leader, and you're trying to establish a platform in your organization, I think I've tried to articulate it here in this process chart. And the obvious one, as I summarize, is focus on the issues. Look at the key factors. Look at the external and the early indicators. Now, these sometimes are going in concert as you're looking at external forces and the early indicators of the problem. You got to look at the uncertainties, the really critical uncertainties. When I was on that plane coming back from Italy years ago, the uncertainty was my biggest obstacle in the sense of what's next, what's the unknown that I was really going to have to worry about. And then was my logic sound, because it wasn't something I was doing in a box by myself. I was consulting with numerous individuals within the organization, the facilities, the logistics, the service units, where my HR individuals supported. And it was all coming up to me, and I was constantly back and forth into the president CEO's office as I was part of a critical planning team. So these 5 or these steps here, and there are 8 of them. You have to look at the scenario logic. You've got to look at the different types of scenarios. It's complex. You're building a pyramid as you're really weeding down activities to get to one that you feel confident and comfortable with in the delivery process. And then the implications and outcomes. Big deal. What are the outcomes and the problems? I mean, we don't want a scorched earth. We want to improve the environment. So you have to be, from a critical thought process, understanding the impact to your workforce and to your stakeholders and your shareholders, because they're going to be looking at you. Did you make a good decision or did you mess up? So, these 8 steps in planning process and these here in your scenario processing are all in the sense of summarizing what we should be doing as leaders. And this one here in the process, because it could change. That early indicator could be up under the focal issues, because you're receiving information or data that tells you how we're going to move forward. So you have to be able to be flexible and adjust this.
Well, fantastic. Does the last slide have your contact information for our audience?
The first slide does.
Oh, okay, great. I was going to say that, yeah, fantastic. And we're going to make the slides available, and tremendous discussion. And the recording will be up soon. At this point, we turn to Mike Woolman for some final comments about when the recording is available. And he has other insights, of course, to leave us with before we go. Michael.
Thank you, Professor Seeger, and I cannot thank you enough, Professor Brittingham, for today's discussion. I mean, honestly, your wealth of experience now translating into the classroom, I cannot say, you know, your type of experience makes me excited to wish I could be a student again, basically, you know, going through some business classes and learning from folks like yourself. But it's such a pleasure that we have this webinar series. Can't thank Dr. Seeger enough for coordinating these efforts and putting these things together. We do have one more webinar coming up with Professor Cynthia St. John. And of course, my slide just went down. What date is that, Dr. Seeger? Oh my goodness gracious. December.
I thought it was December 10th or 11th, but we'll get that out.
Okay, what I'm going to go ahead and do, visit us at fortworth.uta.edu and click on upcoming events. Where you registered for this event, of course, is where you can register for our next webinar, and we hope to see you there. But the recording for this will be emailed out to you. It's also going to be up on UTA Fort Worth's YouTube channel as well. Usually takes us about 3 to 4 business days, so you should expect to see that by about Monday or Tuesday of next week if you're looking to you know, take a peek at this again or forward it on to anyone else that might be interested in the subject area. But thank you again, Professor Brittingham, and to all of our folks that are joining us today. Have a very good Thanksgiving.